Hi, Knibbs here, and I'm about to take you through some brief training in cybertrauma. And whilst I'm just bringing up the PowerPoint, this is a very brief training following some speaking events that I did, because this is really difficult to share on the PDFs that become the handouts. So first of all, I will begin with my definition of cybertrauma, which means that as I share the screen, I'm going to give you a few minutes to read through the academic version of this definition at this point in time. Now, I am going to speak over this at this point because you might want to come back to this and press pause on the screen so that you can read it quite slowly. But realistically, in a very succinct way, cybertrauma is any trauma that involves technology, usually connected to the internet, whether we call that a cyberspace-ready device, an internet-ready device. And the reason that part of the definition is important is because the technology that we are talking about is really what you might be witnessing in terms of viewing inappropriate material, what you are encountering online, what actually causes online harms. And online harms is its own creature, so to speak, at the moment. But my training is more about the impact of what happens when we are in an environment that includes this technology. Now, given this technology has been around for 27, 28 years in terms of the internet, well, it's slightly longer than that, but we will talk about the age phrase that's often used around millennials, and the fact that it was just before the turn of the century that we really became www and beyond. And what I'm actually going to take you through at the moment is something that I'm calling a cyber biopsychosocial model. And this is a new paradigm. And I'm suggesting this because what we often do at the moment is we talk about technology as though it's a thing that we are not part of. We talk about it as though it's a thing that affects us and as though it's a tool. And of course, any of you who have been to my training around cybertrauma, and you understand where I'm coming from in terms of our neurobiology and the way that we have moved into a new space of being, as in human beings in a world of technology, then it's really important that we begin to understand that biopsychosocial models of trauma are generally from a pre-internet stage or a pre-internet phase. And quite often we tend to talk about the biological impact of something, the psychological impact, and the sociological domains in which we operate. But what we have omitted from this conversation for maybe 27 or 28 years is that we are operating in, mediated by, modeled within, and we are partly extending ourselves into a space of technology. So to give you a little bit more around where I'm talking about in this aspect, we have words that we might be familiar with, especially if you've had training in and around human development or human behavior. And of course, if you have ever worked in a business that has in-house organizational systems, you may be familiar with the word intra as well as inter. And in human behavior studies, we tend to talk about intra-psychic and inter-psychic processes. And what I'm suggesting is the parallels of the language here, which you might have heard or thought about in terms of intranet and internet, that actually they represent and mirror exactly what it's like to be a human in today's world. And if we go all the way back to the simple concept of neuroscience, if ever there was such a thing as a simple concept of neuroscience, we discuss the space between neurons as a synapse or synapse if you are from the US. And in between those synapses is where information and knowledge flows, and it's where we really get our understanding of how the brain works with electrochemical signals. Now, when you think about the way that language posits itself to the real world settings, Louis Cozolino, in his book, which I think is 2006, the earliest edition of it, talked about what we have as a social synapse. And that's the kind of space between us when we're in the corporeal world, the real world. And I'm suggesting that we also have a cyber synapse. And over the last 26, 27 years of communication and abilities of us to share information between systems, which might be, as it was in the early days, home computing systems that would dial up and connect to the internet, to where we are now with mobile free roaming connections to almost every other point of contact throughout the world, that I'm suggesting that we also have this cyber synapse. And that's really where I'm talking about the cyber biopsychosocial model, that not only do we or are we impacted by what we do in face-to-face settings, but also everything that we take part in and around and through technology. And I want to emphasize, whilst I don't have it written on the slide here, that we are using both tools and mediums at the same time. And yet the way we talk about technology assumes that it is a tool alone. So thinking about what it is that we're really getting to in this whole process, then we think about, in early developmental psychology and human behavior, we think about this development of the self and how we come to know who we are intrapsychically and then interpsychically between people, and the way that we have relational processes. This is also known as attachment. And this is that innate desire that we have when we are born to connect and bond and attach with usually our primary caregivers. And those processes, the connection, the bonding, the attachment, are slightly different, but I'm not going into that here today. I'm actually talking about what it is that we do on a neurobiological level, and also where we are evolving in today's world in and around technology. Now, most of this connection happens on levels that we would have to get into neuroscience and neurobiology around. So I'm going to just suggest here that this happens through the process of eye contact, being in what we call an interpersonal, safe and intimate distance, and through what we call somatic contact. Now, in order to understand that very quickly, I'm going to talk about this image that you can see here, that mum is looking at her baby, and there is both touch from a eye contact point, and she's actually physically touching the baby as well. So there is a real connection here that suggests that this is a safe and intimate distance. And where I'm suggesting that we now start to think about the cyber biopsychosocial model is that we are now in environments where we have what I'm suggesting is something called attachment, and the change in the way that we now connect with people in our environment in many cases. So it's not all cases. And I'm suggesting that we now have a 3-parent family, which often has an element of somatic contact, has an element of interpersonal safety, and sometimes can include eye contact, but also very, very often is omitting that. Now, the reason I use this particular concept here is because this distance is, when we think about polyvagal theory, is often called a safe distance. It's an interpersonal safety. Now, what I'm suggesting is the way that we interact and through technology, we tend to be around the same kind of distance from our devices and the way in which we interact with that. So you can find more about that in terms of my TEDx talk or my reading, but I am going to summarize it as the 30 centimeter proposition is around about 30 to 40 centimeters because of the way that our eyes work, but also it is a particular distance we tend to sit from our computers or hold our devices at. And in that system, in that space, our bodies give us a signal that actually we are safe when I'm suggesting that this is not. This is called the false zone of safety. So our bodies are tricked into thinking that we are safe when we are interacting with our devices. And this is often why cybertrauma can be such a compounding issue. So when we think about trauma, we think of the types that people will discuss, and they tend to be those that we could possibly classify as environmental, such as natural disasters, but mostly the trauma we tend to deal with as psychotherapists is in the domain of interpersonal. It's in the real world. However, I'm challenging that in terms of our way of understanding cyber trauma. So what I'm going to do is show you a little video, and then I will explain the video, and then I will go on to explain demonstrate really through another video how cyber trauma actually happens and how quickly it can happen.
Baby. Does Mommy's nose scare you when I blow it? Does that scare you when Mommy blows her nose? Yeah?
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replay this video, and I'm going to pause it where I can in terms of being able to show you really what stress and trauma looks like. Now, and I will say this just for ethical reasons, this is not real compounded lifelong trauma for this baby. This is a stressful moment in his life in which he is co-regulated by mum. But it's a really good example of me being able to show you what trauma looks like from the outset. And it means that I'm just going to play and pause the video so that you can understand what I call the stages of trauma. Okay, so as mum is blowing her nose, this little boy is called Emerson, and his body moves into a place of, I don't know what's happening. I need to make myself move away from a stressful situation. And so you see his body move back. At this point, mum has probably taken the tissue away from her face because of the eye contact he's making towards the camera. And you will see that he moves into a space of, it's okay, she's smiling at me, I'm being regulated. And again, mum puts the tissue in front of her face. Now, there are some cognitive reasons as to why Emerson is struggling with this lack of facial contact. But what I can really summarize here is that each and every time mum covers her face with this noise that he doesn't understand, his body moves into a stress response and moves backwards. Now, at this stage, because of stress chemicals that are rushing around his little body and in his brain, which if you want to understand a little bit more around this, you can have a look at what we call the HPA axis. So this is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal glands. And really, these are the stress hormones that help us stay safe. They are necessary for us to produce. And in this moment, it is likely that there's a lot of those stress hormones going around his body. And sometimes we can become what I deem or I call trauma saturated.
You silly baby. You silly baby. Does Mummy's nose scare you when I blow it? Does that scare you when Mummy blows her nose?
Now, what's happening here is Mum is co-regulating little Emerson. She is using a very sing-songy voice that we call motherese. And in doing so, this will actually be helping from a distance to reduce those stress chemicals and lower his level of cortisol, his level of adrenaline and noradrenaline in all of the surges that are going on. Now, it doesn't mean that all of those chemicals have dissipated at this point, but it's really important to note that they are now in the process of being reduced. So what I want you to consider is what happens next.
Yeah?
Now, if I was to show you a scale that the first peak of neurochemicals resulted in the first moving backwards response, if you think about maybe a battery level filling up and where he got to trauma saturation, that's a full battery. And right at that point in time, Mum then starts to decompress and helps regulate him. So it's dissipating and, coming down. Where he's currently at might be around about maybe 60, 70, maybe even 80% of stress level, because he's reduced, for example, by 20%. These are just guesstimates, by the way. They are not exact numbers. So please do not quote me on the exact numbers. And this is currently where he's sitting when Mum blows her nose again. And he now has a response that takes him way beyond his full battery response. And in that moment, I would call that an oversurge. So what's actually happening is he has an excessive response compared to the very first response. So if you like, in the stages of trauma, if it's repeated, you will hit trauma saturation. And if you begin to deregulate yourself and calm down and those stress levels begin to reduce, it doesn't require a large amount of stress or trauma to take you beyond your full capacity and to have an extreme response as he does in that. And if you go back and watch this video, you will notice on that particular movement, there's also a real guttural noise that he makes, which he did not do in the first instance. So, of course, this is going to be something that we could look at, and this is not the training for that, to talk about exactly what happens in trauma and how we manage it when we are co-regulated. Now, going back to the development of the self and Emerson's world here, he's being co-regulated by Mum. This is really not a requirement for children's social care or children's services to go in and remove this child, because Mum is maintaining the eye contact and helping him understand that this is a noise that she may frequently do around winter months, and he will learn that this is okay because Mum is there to help co-regulate him. So he learns how to look after himself in a gentle way. And this is where we can understand about self-regulation. Now, if we don't have those processes, what you will see when we become adults is very, very similar processes. And so I want to show you that in terms of cybertrauma and how and why it occurs in the way that it does. Now, cybertrauma is effectively trauma through the screen. And I'm using the phrase screen here, even though I disagree with screen time. It's often through a screen, whether that's a handheld one that we have over the top of our head, like a VR or AR environment, or whether we're watching television. Now, the next video I am going to give the context and explanation of is a journalist called Joe Tidy, who went to an organisation that removes child sexual abuse material from the internet. You will not see any child sexual abuse imagery. You will only see the journalist. And what I'm going to show you is very, very similar to Emerson. And as I play the video, what you might notice might feel uncomfortable, because you will be watching somebody in distress. And some of you may connect with Joe Tidy's distress more than others. And some of you may feel that you are now feeling uncomfortable. And before I even play the video, I want you to notice the effect of watching somebody in distress and feeling distress or uncomfortable feelings around that, because this is really tapping into the neuroscience of, and where I'm coming from in terms of the cyber biopsychosocial model. So what I'm going to show you next is a gentleman who was briefed before he went in to this establishment so that he knew what it was that he was going to be discussing. And as you can see, when you watch the video, he has a distressing reaction very, very quickly.
About 3 to 6 years old.
It's really realistic.
It's quite realistic.
If I saw that, I would think it was a photoshopped image. Obviously, the pose is disgusting, and that would instantly make me question it's whether or not it's real. But it's hard to know.
So this location is a bedroom, and that's quite classic of real images that we see of children posed in the bedroom. So this.
So you see that type of image?
Yes.
Children doing that pose for children that young?
Yes.
It's a horrible image, just the idea of what she's doing here. I know you've redacted it for me, but it's still...
Yeah, it's
quite hard to
powerful,
see,
and
actually.
it's difficult, absolutely. Absolutely. Because these are images of children being sexually abused, and we can't get away from that because that's what's happening.
Sorry.
It's okay. Do you want to take a break?
Yeah.
Yeah? No, that's fine.
Okay. Again, I'm going to play the video and to stop the video to explain some of what's occurring.
About 3 to 6 years old.
Immediately, this is less than a second into the video, you can actually see Joe Tidy moves backwards just like Emerson did.
It's really realistic.
This is what we call a self-soothing behaviour, where Joe Tidy is clearly trying to manage the feelings that he is now encountering.
It's quite realistic.
If I saw that, I would think it was a photoshopped image. Obviously, the pose is
again
disgusting,
self-soothing. Self-soothing, and also the kind of cough that he's making isn't a cough that's from, for example, talking for a long time or having an irritation on the lung. This is actually what we call a trauma response.
But instantly make me question it's whether or not it's real.
In trauma, we lose the ability to have coherent speech. And as you are listening to this, Joe Tidy's really finding it difficult to form a fully coherent narrative sentence, or even at this point explain himself.
About 3 to 6 years old.
It's really real.
Beg your pardon, just having a technical
About 3
glitch.
to 6 years old. About 3 to 6 years old.
It's really realistic.
It's quite realistic.
If I saw that, I would think it was a photoshopped image. Obviously, the pose is disgusting, and that would instantly make me question it's whether or not it's real. But it's hard to know.
So this location is a bedroom, and that's quite classic of real images that we see of children posed in the bedroom. So this.
So you see that type of image?
Yes.
Children doing that pose for children that young?
Yes.
It's a horrible.
This is also a self-soothing moment. Now, where we are in the point of the video here is one of the differences between adults and children is adults are able to think about and cognitize what it is that they're seeing. And one of the things to know is that Joe Tidy has a ring on his wedding finger. And what is likely happening at this stage is he's beginning to think about children he may know, children he may have, children he may have worked with, And this is one of the difficulties of this kind of cyber trauma. What you actually see next is the movement back that mirrors exactly what Emerson was doing. And he goes into what we might call, instead of the guttural noise that came from Emerson, you might notice that he has a process in which he, let's just call it crumples, where he isn't able to say, I want this to stop, I need to move away. And this is why cyber trauma is so difficult to move away from.
Image, just the idea of what she's doing here. I know you've redacted it for me, but it's still...
Yeah, it's still
quite
powerful
hard to see,
and
actually.
it's difficult. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because these are images
you can
of
actually
children being
see
sexually
his distress.
abused, and we can't
you can
get
probably
away from
feel
that
it.
because that's what's happening.
Sorry.
It's okay. Do you want to take a break?
Now, given that this is something that somebody was pre-warned about watching, I really want to emphasize that we don't generally get to prepare for something that we get to see that might be traumatic. And so what I'm going to do is take us back to this idea of the false safety at which we are sitting from our devices, where we are thinking about how close we are to what it is that we are seeing. And what you might have noticed is that you were also feeling, through watching via a screen, the distress and discomfort that Joe Tidy was experiencing. And that's because it's suggested that we have something called mirror neurons that allow us to experience what we are seeing somebody else experience. So if I take you back all the way through to the cyber trauma definition right at the outset, you can actually see that we can be traumatized by the things we encounter right now, but we can also be exposed to them time and time and time again in the future. And just as an example of this, some of the platforms of social media really give us an experience of encountering what we did time before. So, for example, in Facebook, you might get an on this day or 10 years ago or last week. And that also happens on a number of other platforms. Those choices are taken away from you about whether you decide to go back and look at something. And of course, this form of cyber trauma is really minimal, unless, of course, it's connected to an event that you have an association with. So rather than go into long, deep training around this at the moment, it was just an introduction, a kind of bunny hop across the biopsychosocial model that now needs to incorporate the cyber element. And therefore, this is my proposition around this. So whilst this is also cyber trauma training, I'm introducing a new possible paradigm or concept called cyber biopsychosocial, and how and why this is the new way that I think we need to think about all behaviours that we are studying when it comes to digital technology or immersive technology or anything that involves an internet or cyberspace ready device. Thank you very much.